Friday, and we are working for Crusoe, Friday, March 14th, 2025. In Los Angeles, he is Sam Park. In Las Vegas, Nevada, if you couldn't tell by the wallpaper, I am John Ramey. We're going to talk about Syria, the Kurds, the ceasefire in Gaza, Trump's letter to the Ayatollah, and more Kurds v. Turkey. A lot of updates in the Middle East. Do I have all that right, Sam?
Yes, it's a Middle East roundup today. We're taking a break from the trade wars, which I think we can all use.
Yes. I don't think the trade wars are going anywhere.
No.
Okay, so Syria had a civil war, and then the terrible man, al-Assad, an Alawite, was defeated and fled. And so we've had this interim government from a kinder, gentler former Islamist freedom fighter. And we've got some updates on what's going on in Syria. New York Times reporting, armed groups and foreign fighters linked to the government, but not yet integrated into it, were primarily responsible for the sectarian violence in Syria's coastal region over the past week, according to a war monitoring group in its report. The ousted dictator Bashar al-Assad was an Alawite. Okay, remember that. So hundreds of civilians were killed in just several days in Latakia and Tartus provinces, areas dominated by Syria's Alawite religious minority. That's an offshoot of Shiite Islam.
Correct.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said on Wednesday that the U.S. would, quote, watch the decisions made by the interim authorities. The clashes erupted almost a week ago when Assad loyalists ambushed government security forces, prompting a harsh crackdown that devolved into sectarian attacks on civilians. This is according to the UN and groups that monitor Syria. So violence on the coast is kind of the first part of the Syrian update. But then, this is BBC reporting, a Kurdish-led militia alliance, which controls northeastern Syria, has signed a deal to integrate all military and civilian institutions into the Syrian state, the country's presidency says. The agreement, which includes a complete cessation of hostilities, says the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, will hand over control of the region's border posts, airport, and vital oil and gas fields. Okay, up goes the map right now to show you where the Kurds are in relationship to Syria, but also Turkey and Iraq. And Sam, the first time any of us, I think, heard of the Kurds was during the 1991 conflict in Kuwait, and then the subsequent no-fly zones after that peace in protecting the Kurds in northern Iraq.
That was certainly their first exposure to widespread American awareness, I would have to say.
So we've got Accord in one hand and sectarian violence on the other hand. Is this government going to hold in Syria?
Well, it's a fair question. The accord between Syria and the Kurds could not have come at a better time, because it felt over last weekend that the situation on the coast, which is all the way on the other end of the country, as we can see from the map, could devolve into very serious conflict. And it was ghastly to begin with. I mean, it was certainly a large number of sectarian revenge killings. Let's not, put any kind of fine point on it, right? The Alawite minority, as you mentioned, was the ethnic background of Bashar al-Assad and his father, Hafiz al-Assad, the dynastic dictators of Syria for more than half a century. And they sort of lorded it over the rest of the ethnic background of the rest of the country. Now, that was a very thorny issue. It's very complicated. But, for instance, especially during the Civil War, a lot of Alawites will say, listen, we didn't really have much of an option, because as soon as the war broke out, it was made very clear to us that your sons have to join the army, because any sort of sectarian patronage program there might have been for government jobs is over. We're your only shelter from the Sunni Muslim militants who are taking part in the civil war against our regime.
And they
And
eventually won. The government's Sunni now.
that's right. And now I think that's a fair point. The problem is if all the Alawite sons, or the bulk of them anyway, joined the military at the outbreak of the war, then they took part in the fighting against the other elements of the Syrian population that constituted the civil war, and so they probably took part in some of the ghastly crimes of the regime. And so it was always going to be difficult to resolve this conflict even after the new government took over. There was, for instance, the new president, al-Shara, Ahmed al-Shara, former Sunni Muslim militant, or many would say that he actually is still one, uh, issued, various sorts of amnesties and things like that, and as you say, was trying to integrate all the various armed groups into a unified Syrian armed forces. That process isn't going especially well, right? He's had some success with it, but many of the other groups sort of regard him with suspicion, as well they might. For instance, the Druze community in the very south part of the country is still sort of holding out. They have not really gone very far at all into integrating their militia into the United Syrian Armed Forces. And in fact, the Israeli government, with whom they share a border, has said that they will protect the Druze, which, a lot of people in Syria will be like, thanks a lot. But again, this accord with the Kurds could not have come at a better time. It was revealed on Monday. There was a signing ceremony between al-Shara and the Kurdish leader, Mazlum Abdi. And the Kurdish issue actually has been a long-standing conflict even before the war. And as we've discussed in some of our previous episodes, Kurds in all the countries where they live, which are Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, have always maintained separatist movements. And many people speculate that the accord reached between the Kurdish movement and the new Syrian government was a pretty direct outgrowth of the call for disarmament by the
Ah,
longtime imprisoned Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan, who was the head of the PKK, that is the Kurdish Workers' Party. And he has been in prison for about a quarter century now in Turkey, and has been sort of the living symbol of Kurdish independence, at least amongst Turkish Kurds. And throughout, or maybe not throughout, but for many years prior to his imprisonment and thereafter, even again, even long before the Syrian civil war broke out, the PKK, although ostensibly a Turkish Kurdish separatist movement, they were based in Syria, right? Obviously, that you don't want to be necessarily inside of Turkey. And so this has been a cross-border issue for a very, very long time. And again, it couldn't have come at a better time for al-Shara. One final point I'd like to make about the PKK is that they're sort of an old school national liberation movement. That is, they're all Sunni Muslim, but they're not an Islamist movement, right?
interesting.
They're very second. In fact, they have many female troops, and Öcalan himself has been outspoken in standing up for women's rights inside of the PKK. And
Is
in
that some
this,
sort of vestigial relationship with the Soviet Union
yes,
and global
I mean,
communism?
again, a lot
Yeah.
of these sort of 70s stuff. I mean, they're sort of like the PLO that is the Palestine Liberation Movement used to be, right? Or it's some of the Algerian independence fighters that now run Algeria and have for 60 years, right? It is a very old, or like the African National Congress,
Hmm.
right? It is a very Cold War sort of construct that they've been operating under for, again, prior to 9/11 even, right? This is old time national liberation movement type stuff.
Abdullah Öcalan reporting on his call for the PKK to disarm from Al Jazeera. The consequences of the call by the founder of the PKK, Öcalan, for the group to disband are still reverberating, not just in Turkey but in the wider region. Öcalan, in a statement delivered from a Turkish prison in late February, called on the PKK to, quote, convene your Congress and make a decision. All groups must lay down their weapons, and the PKK should dissolve itself, end of quote. I mean, that is an earthquake for
It's an
the
enormous
Kurds.
development. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things going on in the world right now, but the idea that there could be a large scale disarmament amongst the PKK is a, an event of great consequence in the region.
It's important to understand the Kurds are, they transcend several national borders. I was going to say they're like the Quebecois of the Middle East, but they're nothing like that.
No, that would
It's
be
a
an
terrible
altogether too
analogy.
facile an
Yeah.
analogy. But one, I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
for example, they are a they exist in Syria, they exist in Iraq, and those are both Arab nations. But the Kurds themselves are not an Arab people.
Hmm.
That is and this is mainly expressed in their language, which is more closely related to the Persian language than it is to Semitic languages such as Arabic or Hebrew. And so there's, as we've discussed, centuries worth of animosity between Arabs and Persian peoples, and the Kurds, the Arabs tend to view as amongst the Persian peoples, whereas Iran, the sort of flagship of the Persian peoples, doesn't like them because they're pretty much hillbillies, right? If they had their own country, it would be a landlocked country and very sort of mountainous, right? So they're sort of on the outs with everybody, but there's quite a few of them. It's a large area of land. They would like to have their own nation, or at least they did until now. It seems like Öcalan has gotten to the idea that they should just sort of become citizens of whatever countries they happen to live with. Now, it'll be interesting to see how many of them actually follow through on this. But this is a model that has operated with some success, for instance, in Iraq, right? For where in the northern part of Iraq, it's basically all Kurdish, and they've been able to get along with the government in Baghdad ever since the fall of Saddam Hussein. There's been problems, certainly, right? But there's no real movement for separatism anymore in Iraq. I think that might be what
Mm.
Öcalan has observed over the past 20 years now and say, okay, look, this can work. We can be just citizens of other countries, even if they're run by people with different ethnic backgrounds from our own, which I think is moderately encouraging.
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't a layup that the post-Saddam Iraq was going to have a peaceful inclusion of the Kurds. That was
Certainly
not a
not.
gimme. And in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't the reigning kind of conventional wisdom that the only reason multi-ethnic states like Syria and Iraq could exist were because strong men held people in check, like Saddam Hussein and Assad. And so now it's post-Saddam, post-Assad, and these multicultural nations are kind of figuring it out.
Yes, that's right. And
It's
instead
beautiful.
of breaking up into, different sort of ethnic conclaves,
Yeah.
which, was certainly a danger for quite a long time. And so, again, it's very early days in Syria. Syria still has enormous problems. And al-Sharaa, many people think he's sort of dragging his feet, that he isn't sincere about wanting to establish a multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian, secular society because he has no experience of having done so
Right.
prior to this. And but we should recall that he only took over the country in December. It's been, 3 months. And so, the idea that this should all happen very quickly is, I think, perhaps a bit fanciful. But uh, there's still sanctions that are being levied against Syria, and there hasn't been a lot of movement towards lifting them. But the Syrian economy is on its knees. And so, there's a louder call for the sanctions to be lifted. Many of the Alawites who were fleeing being massacred over last weekend took shelter in the Russian military bases that are still there, by the way. The Russians have not entirely vacated them. They've moved a lot of personnel and equipment out of them, but they still do hold the bases. And as we know, the Russians were well, among the patrons of the Assad regime. And so it's difficult to see how that's going to play out. And of course, American troops have been fighting alongside the Kurdish militia in the east of the country. And so is President Trump going to want to withdraw those troops? We can imagine that he might want to, but the Israelis are not going to want him to do that. They would like there to be some American backing for them inside of Syria as well. So there's still a very serious recipe for instability inside of Syria going forward. And it doesn't seem as though that's going to go away anytime soon.
Okay, Gaza ceasefire talk. Al Jazeera reporting Hamas announces today it has agreed to release Israeli American Eden Alexander and the bodies of 4 dual nationals as it demands Israel enter the second phase of the Gaza ceasefire. Israel's total blockade on all aid to the Gaza Strip is in its 13th day. Al Jazeera reports more deadly attacks on Gaza today by the Israeli Defense Forces, which I believe would be the first since the ceasefire expired. I can't confirm that, but just looking at the reporting before we were recording this. Axios reports White House envoy Steve Witkoff presented an updated U.S. proposal for extending the Gaza ceasefire deal by several weeks in return for additional hostage releases by Hamas and the resumption of humanitarian aid to Gaza. 4 sources with direct knowledge tell Axios. Now, this reporting was from Wednesday. The Witkoff plan included the proposed release of some hostages, including Alexander, who has now been released. It is believed, according to Axios, 59 hostages, now 58 hostages, are still held by Hamas in Gaza. Israeli and U.S. officials believe 22 of them are still alive. Basically, the Witkoff proposal, Sam, is trying to extend the ceasefire until after Ramadan, which is ongoing, and Passover, which is coming up, ends on April 20th. And then also getting the Israelis to allow humanitarian aid into
Yes, and
Gaza.
electricity. And,
Right. I mean, it's been 2 weeks.
Yes, and it seems to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but it seems that this is just a deal to extend the first phase
Correct.
of the 3-phase ceasefire agreement that was reached on the eve of Trump's inauguration in January. And so what the Palestinians would really prefer, and a lot of their Arab neighbors as well, is to actually move on to phase 2, which is what has supposed to have happened already. And it doesn't seem like that's in the offing. And so we can be happy that electricity and food are now being supplied to Gaza again after a period of more than a week. I can't remember exactly how long it's been. But in the big picture, this isn't a whole lot of progress at all. It seems like
So, Sam, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Was the blockade on aid lifted?
I'm not certain. I mean,
Because the last I heard was just there was the hostage exchange. That was like earlier today.
okay, but we can at least hope that it might be
Right.
lifted. And
Because again, it's going on 2 weeks now.
that's right. And of course, one thing that very few people are talking about is the ongoing Israeli incursions into the West Bank, which have been ramping up ever since the war began in October of 2023, and if anything, have only escalated even in recent days. And so the Israelis are not relenting anywhere near to the extent that we might hope they would. For instance, this whole blockade of food and electricity, that's not part of the ceasefire deal, right? This is a pretty egregious violation of at least the spirit of any sort of ceasefire. But again, I can't see that there will be any sort of recompense that will be achieved. Any penalty that will be levied against Israel for these sorts of violations. For example, last week, the Arab League convened in Egypt and came up with a Gaza reconstruction plan, which involved tens of billions of dollars, etc. And this plan was rejected out of hand by both the United States and Israel, both of whom said, no, we don't want to hear about this plan. The plan that we support is Donald Trump's plan for the Riviera of the
That's
Middle
not a
East
plan.
in Gaza. Well, apparently it is. All right, this is the official policy or the stated policy, at least, of both the United States and Israel. And again, as we've mentioned before, this amounts to ethnic cleansing. And now, but before we get up on this horse, we should at least check how high it is. Because as I think we discussed at the very beginning of the war in 2023, the Biden administration at that time actually did quietly ask the Egyptian government to open the Rafah crossing between Egypt and the Gaza Strip in order to allow the Palestinian residents of Gaza to flee Gaza ahead of what would be an enormous Israeli military incursion. And the Egyptians refused to do that, which you can see might have been interpreted by many people as a sort of callous step to take or position to take on part of Egypt. But what the Egyptians were saying was, listen, every Palestinian refugee in every Arab country neighboring Israel hoped to be able to one day return to their homes, and none of them ever have since 1948, because no American president has ever put enough pressure on Israel to allow this to happen. So if we allow a large number of Palestinians into our country, Egypt, we do not believe that they will ever be allowed to return. The Israelis will block their attempt to return to their homes, and you, the United States, will not do anything to make them allow that return. And I think that was actually a pretty empirically justifiable position for the Egyptians to take at that time. So, yes,
Could have saved lives.
it could certainly. But the point I'm making is if we're going to condemn Donald Trump for advocating a policy of ethnic cleansing, we should at least recall that the Biden government was pursuing a policy that would also have amounted to ethnic cleansing in a very practical sense. If people are driven from their territory and not allowed to return, John, that is what it means.
Sure, but we don't know with a second Biden administration or a Harris administration now how this ceasefire phase would be unfolding.
Okay, I'm not saying it's identical, okay? But if the Egyptians thought that...
I mean, look, the assertion is no matter who the American president is, American policy towards Israel is going to be supporting at least the conditions for ethnic cleansing to occur, and I'm not comfortable with that.
Well, I'm not comfortable with it either, okay?
Yeah.
But again, if no Palestinian refugees have ever been allowed to return to their homes since 1948, regardless of who the president is, why should anyone assume that that's going to change?
Okay. Should we talk about the letter to Khomeini?
Yeah, so this is the
Okay.
fun part, I think.
I'll read the reporting from the BBC.
Okay.
Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has rejected the idea of negotiations with the U.S. over its nuclear program, as Tehran confirmed receiving a letter from President Donald Trump. Last week, Trump said the letter proposed talks on a deal which would prevent Iran acquiring nuclear weapons and avert possible military action. Although Khamenei said he had not seen the letter, which was delivered by an official from the United Arab Emirates, he dismissed it as a, quote, deception of public opinion. Continuing the quotation, when we know they won't honor it, what's the point of negotiating? End of quotation, he asked, referring to Trump's decision to abandon the 2015 Iranian nuclear deal during Trump's first term. I just would like to point out the foreign policy incompetence of the Trump administration has me and I think other intellectually honest Americans saying, yeah, I'm with the Ayatollah on this one.
Well, not just that, but
and that's new territory for me.
And for a lot of people, but those are words that could have been spoken a week or two ago by Justin Trudeau. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
In reference
that's fine.
to the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. This is if
it's the Iranian supreme leader, and I'm in agreement with him.
Yes, and saying the same thing as the Prime Minister of Canada.
It's embarrassing.
Yes, and the next day, the president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, came out and said, yeah, Trump can do whatever the hell he wants. It was a direct quote, whatever the hell he wants. We will not negotiate.
Listen, it's hard to argue with our Iranian, not our Iranian friends, but it's hard to argue with what they're saying. I mean, that's right. These are not our friends, and I'm agreeing with what they're saying.
Yes, and it all fits in to the same pattern, right? For instance, when Trump launched the trade war, which we'll get back to in future weeks, a lot of people were saying, oh, well, and Trump himself, in fact, said tariffs are a good negotiating tactic to bring countries to the table. But apparently they're not, right? That's not what he's saying anymore. Now he's saying, no, we have to use the tariffs, right? The tariffs are going to make us rich. The tariffs are going to, result in these wonderful consequences for the United States. We're getting ripped off. We're getting ripped off. We're getting ripped off by everybody. And so apparently it wasn't just a negotiating tactic, right? For instance, when the Gaza proposal was first made by Trump, people were saying, well, this will spur the Arab nations into coming up with their own plan, right? And that's really the end game here. Okay, so the Arabs did come up with their own plan, and the United States said no. So apparently we
want the Trump Hotel Gaza Strip.
That wasn't a negotiating tactic either. So, all these people who are making all these excuses for Trump, he's making them all look stupid. And you know what? Maybe they are.
Yeah, it's just continuing on the BBC report. The Ayatollah warned that Iran would not retaliate in the event of strikes on its nuclear facilities, something you and I have discussed before. Quote, Iran is not seeking war, but if the Americans or their agents take a wrong step, our response will be decisive and certain, and the one who will suffer the most harm is America, said the Ayatollah. The supreme leader who has the final say on all state matters, that's the gig when you're the supreme leader, I guess, also reiterated that Iran was, quote, not interested in nuclear weapons, end of quote. And I suppose that's good.
Yeah, if we believe him, which I'm not sure I do.
Sure.
But,
again, my big takeaway is the Ayatollah is making a lot of sense here. And that's a sentence I never thought I'd utter. Certainly not on the public record.
He's making a lot of sense up until the point where he threatens retaliation in case of American military strike. We've seen what Iranian retaliation against Israel looks like, and it really didn't amount to very much at all.
Look, I don't worry about the Iranian military, but I do worry about terrorism.
Absolutely. And but again, we're talking about American foreign policy in the traditional terms in which we're used to discussing it, as if it's a serious thing. But as we've been discussing,
it's a deeply unserious thing. Right?
It's that's what's so alarming about all of this. And we're not talking about the trade war this week, but we'll return to it. But in all of these cases, it just feels like nobody actually understands what it is they're doing.
That's right.
Or they do understand it, and it's terrifying, right? What they're actually trying to do
It's
is
deeply destabilizing.
that's right, and they might want to be doing that on purpose, and that's even worse. But we don't exactly know which of those two options is actually being applied here. And again, that's disconcerting, we might say.
As we talked about, I believe on the telephone, not on last week's episode, the two leaders in charge of the two largest nuclear arsenals on Earth both seem to think the 20th century and all its bloody lessons was a mistake.
Yes. And
they just seem to kind of want to go back to the late 19th century, and that was not a very good time for most people.
No. And that, I think, is a topic that deserves much further exploration
Sure.
than we have time for today. But I really do think, especially in the case of Trump, that something like that sort of definition really is what's going on here. And we've touched on this in previous episodes, so I'm sure the folks at home will remember those as well. But I think that deserves some fleshing out. And again, it will be applicable to things that we're going to be discussing in future episodes, regardless.
Okay. That'll do it for us on this Friday. What are we looking for next week, Sam? As my basketball season is done, so I will be in a sunnier mood as I will be exclusively covering baseball. Not that there's anything wrong with basketball, but I like being out of doors.
Yeah, sure. Okay. First of all, looking ahead to tomorrow, we should wish a happy Ides of March to all those who celebrate.
That's right.
However,
Ides means halfway through the month. I looked up.
That's right. And although I caution the folks at home, please do not attempt to assassinate a tyrant.
That's right.
The people who killed Julius Caesar hoped that in so doing they would reestablish the Roman Republic. Instead,
it didn't work.
What they were doing was touching off a sequence of events that ended the Republic forever.
That's a good warning, Sam.
Yes, I think it's something that people might want to keep in mind. Next Wednesday, we'll have a meeting of the Federal Open Market Committee, John.
I'm queuing up my dead.
Yes, which will be the first such meeting since the trade war has begun. So that's something that many people will want to keep an eye on. And just today, Canada has a new prime minister, for the time being anyway. Mark Carney was sworn in just a few hours ago. And
new liberal leader before the big election. Yeah.
Which is why he's the prime minister. But he'll be calling an election in short order. And so, he might not be prime minister for very long. But in sort of working for Crusoe style, he's a former head of central banks for two different nations.
Holy cow.
So he's someone that whose life we might want to take a look at on some level. Maybe not next week, but soon enough.
All right. Way to plant the seed, Sam.
Thanks.
Hope everybody has a great weekend. He's Sam. I'm John. Peace.
Thank you, everyone.